Thank you for joining me. I have with me today the beautiful RaQuel Hopkins. And we're here to discuss some very interesting topics. RaQuel, how are you doing? How's it going? What's new with you?
I am great. I don't have anything new. I'm excited about this conversation ever since we've kind of met on TikTok. So I'm
Yes.
looking forward to seeing how the conversation unfolds.
Hey, so RaQuel, how did you get here? Tell me about your journey.
So what's interesting is I actually did not start my career out in the traditional sense that most people do as a mental health professional, going straight from the bachelor's to the master's program and then doing their clinical hours. I actually started my career in HR. So I spent about 10 years in HR, ended up becoming VP of HR for a global telecommunications company. And then back in 2019, I was like, this is it. Like this is it. You get the things and then the things don't have the same meaning that they initially had before. And what's funny is, before I had ever decided to go to college, I wanted to be a psychologist. But they had told me that I would have to go back to school to get a master's degree. And at the time I was like, I don't want to go back to school. Like, didn't know much. And what's funny is I still ended up going to get an MBA and all those things. So I was more so focused on chasing success in the form of money, and not thinking that I would be able to go back and get a master's. So you fast forward to 2019, I was like, I don't know that I enjoy this work as much. I just felt a little unfulfilled.
Okay.
Always been driven to people. And I recall like when people used to tell me when I was young and they were like, she got an old soul. She been here before. Like give her some time to catch up. And when she catch up, you'll be able to see the wisdom. And
I
I
like
had went
that.
to this coaching program. Thank you. I had went to this coaching program and I went to this coaching program and it changed my life, literally, like
Okay.
me as a person, like it worked on me in ways that I didn't even know was possible at the time. I had not tried therapy or anything, but I
Wow.
was also thinking about transitioning out of jar. So I was like, well, maybe this is the time for me to kind of pursue those dreams that I had before. And it was still so rooted in fear because I felt like I needed a backup plan if I'm not going to go in HR and coaching wasn't as popular as it is today.
Yes.
So I always tell people when I can't figure out my life, I have educrastination. That's what I say when I can't figure out my
Educrastination. Okay.
yeah. I call it
You go back to
educrastination.
school?
I go back to school. So if you see me in school, I'm lost again. That's what I told you.
Okay.
If I'm
Okay.
doing another term, especially at this point in my life, I am lost again. I'm trying to figure something out.
Uh,
So I go back. This time I'm in my second master's program. When I start this mental health program, at the time I was working as VP of HR. I was a wife and I was a mom of one at the time. And I don't know, just like what I was hearing in mainstream media wasn't aligning with like what I was reading in the textbooks, and what the professors were teaching were not aligning with what I was reading in the textbooks. So I was struggling. I thought about quitting the program several times because it just didn't align with like my values. And on top of that, it wasn't aligning with what I felt like mental health was really about. So I was like, who am I to think that I can come into this industry? And then when I realized that, I was like, I'm already really good at coping. If these things are only, they're teaching me how to cope. I've been doing that before therapy or any of those things was even a thing.
thing, right.
So what more do I get out of this with also understanding that mental health is something that you use to optimize your life, not necessarily protect yourself? So I don't know. I tell people it was God. Like he's like, there's the other thing at that time I had that belief that you start something, you don't quit it. I don't know that I
Yes.
necessarily believe that
Yes.
today, but I'm
You
glad
do
that I
have an
had
old
that belief.
soul.
Yeah. When you start something, you finish it. I don't care how
Yes.
miserable you are, you finish it. And that's that. So I didn't. And um, I don't know, I kept getting that feeling. I was like, man, like so that's how I got here.
Okay.
That's how I got here. That's how you landed upon my, I guess, my content, my video on TikTok. But I haven't always been as open with sharing my views from a mental health standpoint because I understand that it's to a lot of people, they consider it a very sensitive topic. And I know that for the things that I'm seeing, it could make people feel uncomfortable. And I don't want to take away the work that has been done around creating mental health awareness. So, all right.
You're adding
Yeah, I
to it
really do
because,
feel this way.
okay. Yeah, because your four dimensions of capacity is now, you said that what you saw displayed in the mental health realm and what you were being taught in school was totally different. So, was this part of the process that you used to help build your own framework?
I did. I was taking in all of the information that they were teaching us. And the one thing that I continued to focus on was one, the definition of mental health. Like, cause it's simple. Like, mental health is something that you use. It's not something that's fragile. And the word optimization stood out to me. And I'm like, okay, well, optimize, it means like the best version of yourself, whatever that looks like, right? Because it's subjective. And I started off with this 4-dimensional framework because I was already seeing coaching clients. And then when I got into seeing mental health clients, like, because you now have access to social media and Google, like, people would already come in with like what they thought therapy was and like the
Yeah.
work that they needed to do. So I was starting to pay attention to where people were not really like growing, if that makes sense, like kind of staying in that coping rim. So the emotional component, to me, I broke it down into like 4 pillars. So it was emotional awareness, right? People are great at that because everybody wants to be felt, seen, and heard today. They know how they
Right.
feel, right?
Right.
Emotional regulation, I didn't feel like that was something that people were really like thriving in, and resilience and openness to new experience. So I'll explain the emotional regulation piece. The emotional regulation, we know it's about being able to control and manage your emotions, right? And
Okay.
I'm more of the, I don't want you to try and control your emotions, because if we're trying to appear as emotionally intelligent people, what ends up happening is you can start to suppress your emotions. Well, I know that I'm sad. It's normal because I'm going through this, and then you move on. So emotional regulation in the form of control, what I was seeing was people were rushing to fix emotions, and that's not the goal. You have to truly learn to sit with it and allow it to move. And the resilience aspect of it was, again, so resiliency is like, your capacity to withstand and
Right.
bounce back quickly, right? So
Mhm.
I started paying attention to, I noticed that people would bounce back, but this whole quickly, like bouncing back quickly, like recovering, you didn't really see that, because going back to the emotional regulation, people were aware of their emotions, but they were still pushing through, which is why now you see a lot of days people like constantly need a reset. They
Yeah.
constantly need like self-care days, or they like
Mhm.
adulting is this, or they're
Mhm.
just like drained, still feeling burnt out, even though we have access to a lot of things that we didn't have before. And the other one is the openness to experiences, that falls under this emotional component. All
Okay.
right. So life has taught you a few lessons, and people like never again. I call it ain't gonna happen, never gonna happen again. And I'm like, well, how do you know you learn from it because my mind says that life will present that same test to you to find out if you truly have learned the lesson. But if you already are closed off to experiences that appear to look like a red flag, like,
Mhm.
are we truly developing and growing? Then that took me into the mental piece of it, which is problem solving, critical thinking, your ability to navigate complexity, and then just like this innovative thinking. And the mental component is where I realized that my strengths were.
Okay.
I needed work on the emotional side of it, but I realized that my strengths were in the mental piece of it. And that's how I was truly able to help people, because you creating new ideas based off of what I was learning in this program, like being okay with complexity. So I'll pause because I love this stuff, Tony.
Uh-huh.
So I can go on and on. To be able to ask your questions. Stop me at any time, but I need to
No,
intrude for a
it's
second
good.
because I need to hear.
No, no, I like it because I wanted to know more of how you came about with the dimensions of capacity. So basically, you created the framework because you didn't see where one existed.
Yep.
And you realize that, people are repeating this because they're trying to use these methods and it's not working. So let me create something where they can heal and be healed for a longer time. Tell me if I'm on the right road or the right
Yeah,
page.
I was looking
Okay.
for something that was actually more sustainable because I know personally for me, I was like, I don't want to live a life where I'm constantly coping through it because if I'm constantly coping, like I constantly have to find these resets. Like, where's the balance to where I feel like I really switch from survival mode over into like thriving?
And you found it by these dimensions, right?
My strength is in problem solving, critical thinking, complexity, or being able to, like, for example, if I go back to when I was in the mental health program, I would see a theory that was tied to children only. And I'm like, well, actually, this actually applies to us as adults too. Like, the only difference is the ownership comes from your caregivers now to yourself. So my mind would just works that way. So to where you can see one thing and see how it applies to many things versus it just being this only putting it neatly into a box like this only applies to children. I'm like, well, no, actually it applies to adults. It's just when you start to think about it differently, it changes the way that you start to approach certain milestones or developmental gaps with people. So I use all of it. I use all of it.
It's like a
Yeah, I
MacGyver
use
for mental health, because he could take anything and make it work.
no way. That's me. That's
Uh,
me. That's me. And to be honest, that's when I think about like that's why I struggled in the mental health program because I'll never forget. I was reading it said like 5 types of privileges, right? And it was like no disability, being a male, race, your socioeconomic status, and I don't remember the other one. And I was like, I started going through the list and I was like, okay, well, I checked this one, I checked this one. Oh, and heterosexual was the other. And I was like, okay, I checked like 3 out of 5 or something. And I was like, you know what people discount as a privilege? It's people's ability to navigate adversity. And I was like, that is like a strength of mine. So I didn't realize how much I had appreciated like my sense of resiliency until I got into this mental health program. And I felt like a lot of it was like victimizing me. And I was like, I ain't no victim. Like, I'm not
yes.
no victim. I'm not a victim because I'm black. I'm not a victim because I'm woman. I'm not a victim because at one point I had nothing and it just didn't, none of it resonated with me. And so,
I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to talk with more Black therapists like yourself who say this is what I've been taught in school, but in my mind, that doesn't make me a victim. It makes me a victor. I've learned to be stronger because I am a woman. I've learned, it's certain things that I've learned to put in place because I have what they said is a deficit. So thank you for sharing that. So those
yeah.
traditional coping methods and all of that, it just doesn't fit so much in your framework.
It does
Or
not.
okay.
Now I will say because I have more freedom in terms of choosing who I work with because I don't position I use my content to use the therapy background, but I work with coaching clients.
Okay.
Now, in getting my hours to become a therapist, you don't really get a lot of freedom of autonomy there to really choose who you work with. So you may get people that come in and you need to start with the coping mechanisms because you do want to get people to a basic functioning place, right? Because we all do have different experiences. So it's not that I'm anti coping. I just think that anti coping mechanisms don't serve you long term. They're short term strategies to get you to a basic functioning place. And if you never challenge those basic coping mechanisms, you can find yourself living a life to where you're constantly in survival mode. Like it's tricky. Like you feel like you're doing the work and you're moving forward, but you're really not. You've just done what you needed to do again. And it's just you continue to repeat this cycle. You continue to repeat this cycle.
Okay. Do you have an example of a client that you've worked with where you've had to put some of your methods in place? Where
So
they were repeating the cycle. Perhaps they had already gone to a therapist and they were trying to use some of those coping mechanisms and it just wasn't working. So what did you do or how did you approach that person?
So whenever I'm always upfront about my style and how I work with people. So I never talk about those coping mechanisms. For example, like
Don't bring it
boundaries, I
up.
don't say, okay, in a session, like we need to establish boundaries. I'll guide you to establishing boundaries without saying that you're establishing boundaries. Because I just feel like some of this language that we have as mental health professionals, most people don't know how to use it. So I feel
Uh,
like you can support people without, like, I can know that, okay, Tony's sitting in front of me and what she's saying and how I'm seeing how it's impacting her is probably really trauma. I don't make that decision. I listen to you, and based off of my expertise, I should be able to facilitate or guide you in a way to where you feel like you're moving forward without throwing another label on you or another thing to do. Because I tell people, my approach is more so people want a lot of how to do this, how to do that, how to do that. And I think that over time you start to lose more and more of your voice or get in touch with your authentic self. So I'm more about less about the how and more about the who. So I
okay.
always tell people
Okay.
I'm focusing
Okay.
on who you are, who you want to become. So I don't approach any of my sessions in that way. And I remember like when I was training for my therapy hours, I remember telling, it's funny because if I believe in God. When God tells you that, like, I want you to go a certain way, I remember I had told a client, I was like, well, maybe you need to establish boundaries with some members of your family. And it felt so inauthentic to me, but I was like, that's the thing to do.
That's I
Like,
mean,
she's
right, right.
struggling, what she needs to do. She was like, the idea of boundaries. Like, she was like, I still want to have a relationship with them. She was like, I got to figure this out. And I was like, music to my ears because I
Mm,
thought the same thing. So for me, it's just like I said, it never resonated with me. And even if I wanted to do it, it's like I always receive pushback on the other side because I just don't think that that was how I'm supposed to show up in this space.
let's talk about that hurt people place because that's how I first stumbled upon you, Raquel, is that you were talking about the hurt people, and you know how in your framework that really doesn't apply so much. Let's talk about that.
So I think in that video, I said that hurt people ain't hurting people that ain't hurting. And what was
Yes.
funny is I was actually talking to a family member that didn't come from a client or a friend. No, hurt people ain't hurting people that ain't hurting.
Okay.
And I was actually, this had nothing to do with a client or even the framework. Like I tell you, like my mental strength is like, I think that that is like my gift. Like that's where I'm really strong at. I was talking to a family member and this family member was like, well, you know, hurt people. And I was like, for the person that we were talking about, I was like, well, I ain't hurting. I'm not hurting. Like hurt people that ain't hurting. And then I had this moment where I was like, well, where am I hurting in my life? And that's where it came full circle because people can't mirror something to you that's not there. Like, I don't even, if you're hurting and I'm not hurting, I don't know how I could receive that per se, especially when I'm rooted in, I gotta go back to self trust. Maybe that isn't a framework from a relational standpoint. But if I'm not hurting, you can't hurt me
Okay.
because I recognize that your pain is your pain and pain is inevitable, right? We
Right.
all will experience pain. So this idea that one hurt people is a bad thing, I don't necessarily subscribe to that because
Hmm.
no, I think you've never gone through life like hurt. Like that just sounds crazy. Like I guarantee you can find somebody that would tell you that you've been the villain in their story because we've all experienced pain at some point and
Right.
it reflects back to other people. But there are some areas in my life where I'm like, I am not hurting. And for
Okay.
the areas where I may be hurting is because, you know, whether it's my judgments, my expectations of other people, or a particular person, for example, that's where the hurt echoes back at.
Okay. Now, for example, if you encounter someone who has been hurt, so much so that they are just bitter and they strike out at you, you're saying that it wouldn't hurt you if you're not hurting. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep. And I think that the hurting, like if we were to break down what does it mean to hurt, I think so. What comes to my mind is it's judgment. A lot of times we have judgments about how people should show up, and I don't make. I'm not saying I don't make judgments, but there are
Yes.
a lot of people in my life, for example, that I don't make judgments about. And because I don't make judgments about who they are, because I also accept that everybody's on their own journey, I'm able to see people for who they are, like truly meet you where you are. So I think it starts there. It's the judgment. If you think about things that we get hurt by, whether it's like your parents and them not showing up for you in the way that you thought that they should have, like the only way to really come to the pain piece of it is
Hmm.
you have expectations around who you think people should be and how they should show up for you.
Okay. So it's the
And that's a
expectations that causes the hurt. So if I expect you to show up a certain way and you don't, then I kind of internalize that, and then that hurts me. Is that what
yeah,
okay. Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's interesting. When we talked about that before, I was still trying to wrap my head around it, because on the flip side, for me, I've been working with loved people, love people. And I figure if you have been loved, and I think more so with children, you can always see
mhm,
or recognize a child that is in a loving, supportive environment, because they come off very loving. They will run to you and not think anything of it, because they have been taught how to love. So my belief is that when you are taught to love and you're in a loving environment, that can kind of come through as part of your personality. Not saying that, people are not mean in some cases, or children are
yeah,
not
yeah,
mean in some cases, but I believe that loved people, if you're in a loving environment, you naturally love people. And when you are a person who you're being hurt, or you've grown up in a very hurtful environment, you sort of put that out.
Well, I said I would pull. So I hear what you're saying, and I
Okay.
wouldn't. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I would say when you talk about like hurt, right? Like hurt shows up in many different forms. Whether it's,
Right.
I mean, hurt could show up. Until my kid just came to my head. Let's just say you rubbed his head. Right when you encounter him, he may pull back because what you don't know is that he gets joked in school because he has a big head, or people say that he has a big head, right? So the loving piece that you would probably get, you'd be like, oh, he kind of standoffish, but he's probably thinking that you're being funny or validating something, that message that he's receiving from elsewhere. So I think
Gotcha.
it's, you go back to this emotional component, the ability to experience it all. Like, I don't think we should put a judgment on the loved people versus the hurt people, because we're human. We're supposed to experience the complexity of all of those emotions, because without pain, how do you really know joy? Without joy, like, how do you know pain? Like, they all come together to describe like who we are. And I just think that when we're thinking about, I know oftentimes people refer to like childhood, like people are being shaped in many different ways. My son's in his environment is not just home. His environment is school, it's the classroom, it's the lunchroom, it's the soccer field, it's when he's online playing games. All of those things are shaping you. And he could be talking to another kid that's not coming to an environment from an environment that you're talking about, like a loved environment, and they project in essence, right? Like,
Right.
that's why I say life offers so many complex experiences. Sometimes when people tell me that certain things happen from child, I'm like, how do you know for sure that it came from that? Unless it's just blatant, right? Like abuse or harm.
Yeah.
Like, how
Yeah.
do you know when you have so many experiences that are always testing and challenging, like the core essence of who we are as people? Like, how do you know?
Right. Right. Unless it's one of those where you've been sexually assaulted or some abused, or
Exactly.
okay. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or just in an environment. If I take myself, I mean, I lost my mom when I was 11 years old to an overdose. So it tells you like a lot, like my mind as a kid, like, it's one thing to lose your parent to death, and it's another thing to lose your parent to like an overdose, to drugs. And
Right.
so those things, like those, but those are the things that people would say, like, as a therapist, I can see how that would create trauma, but people don't talk about the other side of it too. Like, when I talk about like my capacity to love and not judge people that don't show up in the manner that I do, that's what I would refer to as post-traumatic growth. It's been transformative for me, because at one point where I just didn't understand, like, because I always used to tell myself, well, she wasn't a crackhead. Like, she would
Okay.
use occasionally, and no different from what you would see rich people probably
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
But why did you have to take my mom? But, and also, like, did you ever, I thought that she was selfish and all those things. And as I've
This
become an
is you.
adult,
You're
I'm like,
saying that when you were a child, you
from,
thought that, or okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, as a child, I thought, and as I've gotten older, I'm like, life is tough. Like, life is tough. And, while her thing to cope may have been drugs, I mean, mine is an expensive trip to where I'm like, okay, YOLO. And then you come back and you look at your bank account and you're still on zero. Like, I'm not thinking about my kids in that aspect. My transformation from what they were referred to as drama, I started seeing myself different. I'm like, you're no better than her. Like, you just saying that, well, she did drugs and you just had another drug. Or when you just put whatever in your body or what you eat, you're not thinking about your kids from a health standpoint. That's why I say trauma.
yeah.
When people say you can't trauma, I'm like, I don't think that we get to make those calls per se,
You
because
you you went out. You can't what trauma? You
we don't
said
get to
people.
make people say that you can't heal from trauma. I
Okay.
say I don't necessarily disagree with that,
Mm-hmm.
because if it ain't good yet, then in my opinion, God ain't done. But so I don't necessarily agree with that. I do understand how people can get stuck in that place, but I don't think it's like this blanket response or answer that if you've experienced trauma that you can't overcome from it, because trauma has the ability to also transform you. And that's another thing that we don't talk about in the mental health space, like post-traumatic growth disorder. Like, it's a real thing. It's a real thing.
Talk about it. So you, because you've gone through some traumatic experience, you have the ability to grow. So you're resilient.
Yeah, you do.
You've been, mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I think that that's the piece that people tend to miss, because when we talk about trauma, trauma is your perception of what's happening. Yeah, it's your perception, which is how they say you can grow up in the same household and one kid turns out this way and another kid turns out this way, because there's nothing that says, like, for sure that this is trauma.
this
If
is
we're
the
talking
right
about it from a
way.
subjective standpoint. Right, right. Unless we're talking about assault, molestation, like, I don't think anybody has to think about those things, right? Like, it robs somebody of their sense of security. Like, you feel helpless, you feel hopeless, you're almost incapable. But if someone says that I don't like you, or if your parent rejects you, I mean, it's subjective. It's subjective
Okay.
because not everybody responds to it the same way.
Okay, so for the person who has gone through the parent who rejected them or didn't show up for them and they are stuck, what would be your advice to help them to get out of that place, to help them to thrive?
Always tell people empathy. Place yourself in another person's shoes and see if you can see yourself in them. Like, if you can't find any things that y'all have in common in terms of how you could do or be that person, because I guess maybe you sit at the highest of the highest, then that's an issue to me. That's what I tell people. Like, because I go back to my own personal story. I was able to see myself in my mom, in the sense of I could cause my children pain too. Maybe not in the same way, but I can do it too.
Give me an
So
example.
so like I was saying before, like, the decisions that we make daily, the decisions that you make on a daily basis have the ability to impact other people when you're just living your life. Like, every decision that I make can impact my children. And I don't get to decide what is best for them per se.
Hmm.
I don't get to decide that, even though I feel like it's best for them. I don't get to decide that.
They
They will
get to,
decide that. And I say that because, when I got into this mental health space and I started seeing so many different people, I've literally heard people come in and say that they're healing, that they need to heal from their trauma because they had good lives. And I'm like, what?
Well, wait. Go back. They need to heal from their trauma because they had good lives.
Yeah, because their parents provided too much for them or offered them too much, and now they're finding it difficult to, to navigate life because everything was handed to them. I've heard someone say before that I grew up in a household with mental health professionals before, and all we did was talk about feelings, so much so that it was never okay for like my brother and I to fight. So those are all of the best intentions, but you don't get to decide what people take away from it, the meaning that they assign to those experiences.
It's up to them to decide. Okay.
Yep.
I like the way you think, Raquel.
Thank you.
Yes, I do. I do. Now, in the midst of like, I feel like I am going through trauma right now with what's going on in our current climate. What advice would you have for me or for people? I don't want to call it trauma, but it is kind of traumatic. So what advice would you give to someone like me we're trying to cope in this environment? What would you tell them?
Coping is good. Remember, like, it ain't always bad. Sometimes that's all you have, right?
Uh-huh.
Because if you're able to cope, it means that you can continue to do what you're doing right now, right? Like if this political climate had such an impact on you to where we're talking about trauma, when people like are in trauma, like your ability to truly function to where you feel hopeless and helpless, that kind of goes away. So I would say your ability to focus on coping is a good sign, right?
Okay.
You're not going to be able to cope long term. Like if the next political climate is a reflection of this, and then you get another 8 years of that, and then before you know it, it's 12 years, and it continues. Because I think that that is what people are nervous of. Like, what does this? If they consider this to be a setback, what does this look like for the future, especially for
Future.
people that look like you and I, right?
Right.
So that creates a sense of helpless and hopelessness because, and I can see how that could end up becoming something that is traumatic because it's less about the next 4 years and it's more about how does this 4 years impact the next 8 years, the next 12 years,
Right.
those things, right? But it's also going back to when you talk about these coping mechanisms, we have to live in the present moment. Like you can't possibly predict what's going to happen in another four
No.
years. So the coping aspect of it goes back to how do you deal with today in this present climate? Are you able to, well, I would ask like, in what ways does this make you feel helpless? Right? To see if you're really forward thinking and not thinking about today. In what
Okay.
ways does this make you helpless? And I think that if you start to really think about those things, you'll realize that your emotions have probably gotten the best of you because you are still able to move forward. It goes back to, and I'll share this because, when people ask me like, why do I seem so detached from it? One of the things that people don't know about me, Tony, is like when I came out of, I always tell people that, and if can I say a curse word up here?
Yes, you can.
I tell people that I went from shit to sugar. And then when I got to sugar, I was like, I want to go back to the shit because the shit, I feel like I knew how to thrive in that. So don't really come for me.
Goodness, that's
You know
good.
my story from my story from the sense of losing my mom at an early age to an overdose. By the time I get to college, I found out that I have a family member that had made it. And when I say made it, like created a multi-million-dollar business, and I came and I worked for him. Worked for this family member, and I thought that meant that you just wouldn't have to experience certain things. I was cursed out in that company. And I didn't know that these things were microaggressions because I had never wanted to talk about what I was struggling with because of nepotism. So I never
Right.
felt comfortable talking to other Black women because I'm like, they're gonna be like, girl, shut up. You ain't going through nothing. You work for a family
Such
member.
and such.
I had people question, like, do you have your MBA? I had people call me incompetent. I had people curse me out.
Mm,
I got a chance to see what it looks like when you actually have power, like all of these different things. So for me, While I know that some things are truly race, I think that it's hard for people to understand what people are willing to do for power and what they're willing to do with power. And I've seen it firsthand.
Okay.
I've been the person with the power, right? Like I could fire you because your name was Billy.
Right.
Could, because that was the environment I was in. Or I could have the family member come to me and say, I want to get rid of X for whatever reason. And I think that because I know that, like, I don't take those things personal. Sometimes it's
Okay.
not always race. Sometimes it's just people. Like,
Yes, people.
it's just people. And I think that because a lot of people have not necessarily had that exposure, again, we're not able to see ourselves in other people. We take every single thing that a person does personally. Everything ain't about race. Some of it is just people showing up in their human nature. And because I've had those experiences, it's hard for me to see life beyond those to where I take it so personal because I'm like, I got treated worse here than what I probably would have gotten treated out in corporate. And the thing is, I didn't expect it here because we're in control. But it
Right.
still didn't stop people being people. That never changed.
Okay. So what was the shit and what was the sugar? Oh, the shit
The
was
sugar
where
was like, so the sugar was like growing up with nothing, growing up in the projects, the typical story. That was the shit. The sugar was, all right, you're making decent money. Y'all are in control. You're working, like we're creating generational wealth, all of those things.
yeah.
And I struggle. I understand that I struggle now because it was just a transition from what I knew into going into something different, but
Was
I
it
didn't
also your
expect any of that.
expectation? Oh, okay. That's what I was getting ready to say.
I didn't expect any of that stuff. I mean, I expected those things out in corporate, but I still was working for a corporation. Like, corporation is a corporation. Like, even that family member, like, money talks. No matter where you're, like, money talks.
Even in the church.
This whole, yeah, yeah, they're in the
From
church.
my
And I think that when people,
background, money talks even in the church.
yeah, and when people can pull themselves outside of like their situation, you can start to see the complexity of how all of it comes together. And so for me, this political environment, honestly, I'm not fazed by it because I'm not surprised by it. Like, I think that until you become president and then you can see like who you are and what it's always easy to say what you will do and all those other things. But until you actually have some real power, you don't know what you would do.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. And I think we forget that because we're on the outside looking in. I'm always very careful when it comes to judging leaders because until you're in that place of leadership, you don't really know. You're just on the outside looking in.
Yep. And I didn't know that, like, working with that family member, because I remember becoming resentful and just angry. I'm like, because I had the same views. I'm like, you don't sit in their seat. Like, you don't have their experience. You don't have any of those things. And I just think that you don't know until you know. Like, until you can have power and wealth and you can see, I mean, even when you think about like, the whole DEI, like I tell people, like, if you have your organization as a Black person, how many white people do you have working for you?
Mm. Mm.
I think it's so easy for us to always, that's what I'm saying, we're always looking at somebody else, but do you got any white folks working for your
Right.
Black organization? Because most of the time what we do is we hire, well, we create the justification that we're giving people opportunity that wouldn't otherwise have. It still doesn't change that you lack diversity in terms of how we view it. You got a lot of bunch of Black folks working for your company, but you want them to hire you. And I'm not saying that it's not wrong per se, but I'm
Right.
saying when you can take a step back and realize like what you do with your freedom of choice, you'll realize that you probably ain't much different from some of these people that you think you are.
What's next for success is complicated? And if you could tell me a little bit about how you came up with that name.
Um, I'll start with, so how I came up with that name is I was sitting in my sugar As
Mm,
I told you, and I was pacing back and forth in that office, and I was like, I do not want to be here. I don't want to be here. I was like, something is missing. I was feeling all of this guilt and shame because for a person that looks like me, like everybody dreams of this and you got it. And, you got all of the perks. You don't wake up thinking about whether you're going to lose your job or anything, but it just didn't I feel like I was living somebody else's life. And I had went to church that prior week and the sermon was on like, it's complicated. And then as I was pacing back and forth in that office, I was like, well, success is complicated too, because this wasn't where I wasn't currently my version of success. Yeah. So that's where the name came from. What's next? I don't know. I don't know. And I'm okay with that. What I do know is I'll continue to show up, shift the conversations around mental health so that people really understand what mental health is, because that's just something that I'm really passionate about, while also getting people to really focus on themselves. I think we do too much of they and them conversations
okay.
without focusing on your own internal structure. So that's what I'll continue to do. And whatever opportunities come from that, I'll be open. So I don't
Okay.
know.
Do you have any books or have you written down your framework where people can use it and apply it?
I would tell people that if you're interested in getting connected with me,
Hmm.
I am on TikTok. I'm like, I don't even know my name on TikTok. So on TikTok is RaQuel, RaQuel underscore capacity underscore expert. And then Instagram, because you can't have a long name on there. My Instagram is my first name, RaQuel underscore the underscore capacity underscore
Okay.
expert. So I branded myself as the capacity expert, which is basically capacity is not about the traditional way that people think about filling up a cup and then it overflows. It's more so about who do you need to become and less about like what's actually on your plate. So find me on my social media platforms, and for whatever's new and next, I'll share it there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. You got my email.
Okay. She said, "Don't come to my door. You got me."